we get a promise of reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers to our trade with China through free trade or sectoral trade deals. If we don't comply with PRC demands, then we face retaliation. So after we detained the Huawei CFO, Meng Wanzhou, at the request of the United States, because she's alleged to have committed serious crimes of fraud, China then arbitrarily banned Canadian canola seeds, $3 billion agricultural commodity every year to China, and then on similarly spurious grounds banned all Chinese wheat imports into meat imports into China, so which is also an enormous loss to Canadian farmers. These arbitrary measures imposed by the Chinese to put economic leverage on Canada are completely without justification. Our canola seeds, of which 40% are sent to China, are fine. None of our other customers have any problems with our beautiful little black seeds. And the meat was based on Chinese falsification of Canadian veterinary certificates. In other words, a Chinese producer who put in an additive called ractopamine into the meat, a growth hormone, which is banned in China, then certified that the meat was good Canadian meat from Canada. It has nothing to do with Canada. The banning of Canadian meat exports into China is completely without any legitimate justification whatsoever. Not to speak of the hostage diplomacy, the harsh detention of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig on false charges without due process of law, where they're being subjected to harsh treatment, which would, from what we know, violates China's commitment to the UN Convention Against Torture, and also because they're interrogating Mr. Kovrig over matters to which he became privy as a diplomat, including Five Eyes security secrets, presumably China's violating the Vienna Convention on Diplomacy of 1961. So China demands that Canada agree to install the Huawei 5G into our Bell and Telus telecommunications systems against the advice of Canadian security experts and our allies, and that Canada should remove restrictions on Chinese state acquisition in the Canadian energy and mineral sectors. And in exchange for that, we have a promise of reduced tariff rates. And none of this is reciprocal. China would never allow for foreign access to China's telecommunications. And the Chinese constitution explicitly forbids foreign acquisition of Chinese national resources on Chinese national security grounds. So they want us to agree to China doing things in Canada that they would never agree to Canada doing in China. Their other demands are that Canada cease criticism of Chinese cyber espionage and political influence operations that involve covert, coercive, or corrupt measures, including Chinese state harassment of people in Canada, such as persons of Uyghur descent. Now, if you look at the circumstances of China's involvement in Canada, if you download the list of diplomats accredited to Canada off the Global Affairs Canada site, you'll see that China has 168 accredited diplomats. This is by far the largest number of diplomats of any single country. The United States, with whom we have, of course, much more intense interaction in trade and all other areas, has 120. And then after that, countries have, double digits or single digits. So the question is, why does China have so many diplomats in Canada? Is it that a lot of these diplomats are involved in United Front work, involved in trying to use means to foment interest with the Canadian political and business elite, and to pressure persons with connections to China to ensure compliance with China's national interests? And this includes, a number of my Uyghur friends who have been harassed by agents of the Chinese state, and they call the local police tell them to get in touch with the RCMP, they get in touch with the RCMP tells them to get in touch with the local police. Amnesty International has been asking the Canadian government to appoint some kind of coordinator to deal with the problem of Chinese state harassment of people here. And so far the government's not prepared to do so. In fact, there have been government documents that have suggested that Canada should not be doing this because it's unnecessary. There is no problem, such as has led to the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, designed to counter this sort of activity, and that it would have a negative impact on the overall relationship with China. So, you know, all of these complaints and social issues amount to us not raising concerns over China's support for regimes like Venezuela or North Korea, not doing any effective criticism of China's domestic human rights abuse, or in fact doing anything to effectively stem the flow of Chinese fentanyl and derivatives into Canada, which, you know, we know this stuff comes from factories in southern China through Chinese shipments and envelopes. We've given support to the Chinese police to try and assist in investigations against the fentanyl, and the fentanyl, of course, is still coming in, resulting in large numbers of premature deaths here in Canada. So we've been largely compliant with China's demands on us. We have a China policy that I think is informed on the one hand by naivete and on the other hand by greed. While the Canadian government has made strong statements condemning, for example, the incarceration of the distinguished Uyghur scholar Ilham Tohti, and we have, with like-minded allies, raised concern over the Turkic Muslim re-education concentration camps, we evidently hold China to a different standard than other countries because of the economic imperative. As Rukia alluded to, in 2017, the Parliament of Canada adopted the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, the Sergei Magnitsky Law. This is a legal measure that sanctions foreign individuals involved in human rights crimes. So far, we've used this legislation to list and sanction officials from Venezuela, South Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, all for very good reasons. But there's not a single person listed on our Magnitsky list from the People's Republic of China. Why not? Surely if it's a Canadian law, that one would have the same standards applied to persons of whatever nation they come from in terms of the criteria for determining if a foreign official qualifies for this ignominious singling out. Obviously, by applying targeted sanctions against Chinese officials, Canada would send a powerful message to Beijing that we stand firmly for human rights and democratic values. But we are not prepared to do this. I'm not aware of any Canadian political party in the upcoming election committing to do so if elected. On the other hand, US lawmakers are currently exploring the possibility of applying measures through the proposed Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. Canada is doing nothing remotely comparable to support this initiative internationally. We talk, but we don't act. The bottom line is that we need to be doing much more to support our Uyghur brothers and sisters against China's brutal and oppressive campaign, amounting to, first of all, cultural genocide, and of course, gross violation of their rights to life and freedom. I feel ashamed on behalf of all Canadians that our government is essentially standing idly by in the face of the horrific suffering of Uyghurs, both the Uyghurs who are suffering horrors in these camps, and the Uyghur Canadians who are suffering enormous pressure under the weight of what they know is going on. By giving no effective response to China's Uyghur crisis, Canada is giving the PRC tacit consent for the hideous outrage against humanity that this horrendous, massive network of camps represents. We have a choice. We can continue to uphold Canadian hypocrisy as necessary to sustaining our existing relationship with the Chinese regime. Or we can decide that standing up for what we believe, our Canadian values of humanity and justice, is more important than appeasing the Chinese regime's gross violations of the rules-based global order. History demands that we see what is going on with the Uyghurs with a renewed moral clarity, and that we do everything we can to stop it. Thank you.
So you're next. We're going to get your PowerPoint on. Is it that one, DJ? Is that the one? Yes. Okay. And you have the signal to our colleague in the back, and she'll switch it for you when we go to the next slide.
Hello everybody, my name is Orsi Yazeci. I'm original from Albania, but I'm Canadian as well. And for people who have seen my videos, for those who have seen, I've become famous in the recent days. And this is related to a trip that I had in China, in Xinjiang, between August 16 and 25, 2019. So the story goes like this. I approached the Chinese embassy in Tirana, Albania. And I told them that I am a journalist, I have a PhD in history, and I told them that I'm interested to know what is going on in China with the Uyghur Muslims. Since I'm specialized in the history of Islam, and I deal a lot with radical jihadi groups, especially with the radicalization of Muslims in Europe. So I was a bit suspicious. I thought that the Americans or somebody in the West is creating again new fake stories, like they did in the case of Syria. And I thought, oh my God, we will have a second jihad now against China. So my intentions were good. I approached the Chinese embassy in Tirana, Albania. I sent them one email, they called me, they interviewed me, and they were convinced that I was on their side. And actually, I was. I thought they are somehow, in a way, being victimized by fake news articles being published in the West to demonize the great socialist republic, People's Republic of China. So, in the beginning of August, I was contacted by the embassy. They told me we have a seminar coming in Xinjiang, and this seminar is being organized by the Information Office of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and the Information Office of the State Council of China. We were a group of journalists coming from all over the world. We were about 20 journalists. So we were mainly from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Czech Republic, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Sweden, and so forth. So I was included in this group, and the Chinese authorities were very kind with me. They covered all my expenses, including my ticket, for which I'd like to thank them, because they will be watching and listening to what we're saying. So with this good intention and desire, I landed in Urumqi on August 15 or 16. This is my, can you send to the first slide, please? So this is my picture, but this is not in Urumqi, this is in Kashgar. The last city that we visited is Kashgar. This is inside the airport. And as you can see, the Chinese authorities, they are very concerned about the bad image that they are getting outside of China, and the bad reports that the world is learning about their persecution and repression against the Uyghurs. So the whole state propaganda in all Xinjiang, Turkestan, was in a way trying to convince us as foreign journalists that China loves the Uyghurs and big comrade Shin who is here, I am standing in the middle of them, is shaking hands with the good Uyghur proletarians who follow the commandments, the holy commandments of the Holy Communist Party of China. However, the things were not like this. If you can go to the second slide. So our Chinese friends, they invited us in Urumqi. So on 16th of August to 17 to 18, we stayed in Urumqi in a 5-star hotel, first class treatment. And we had a number of lectures from a number of Communist Party officials. From this person, his name is Jeok something. He was like the main communist official of the region. And we also had lectures from others like Mr. Ma Pinyan, who was historian, and the most important guy is Mr. Shu Wijian. I'm sorry to pronounce your name. But he was the chief of the Xinjiang propaganda department. So he was in a way the Goebbels of the Communist Party in Xinjiang, the guy who was in a way legitimizing what China is doing with the Uyghurs. So the propaganda that we received, if you can go to the next slide, and the lectures that we were delivered, were telling to us as foreign journalists that China is suffering from terrorism, and these Uyghurs, they are terrorists because they are Muslims. So the main thing was that the Uyghurs, first of all, they're not from Xinjiang, but they came somewhere from Central Asia, I don't know where, because during the lectures that we had, our Communist Party friends, they lectured to us on a number of white papers that the Chinese government has published regarding Xinjiang. And the theme that we were presented by the Chinese was that the Uyghurs are terrorists, but the Chinese government is a good and benevolent government and is fighting terrorism. Well, but as a professional historian that I have a PhD in history, I am specialized in nationalism and state propaganda. And I know very well, for example, what the Nazis did in Germany against Jews, or what the Serbian propaganda of Slobodan Milosevic did in ex-Yugoslavia against the Kosovars or the Bosnians. The narrative that we were getting from the Chinese was very similar to what I've read, analyzed, and dealt with in Europe. They were depicting the Uyghurs as foreigners. They were showing Xinjiang as being eternally Han-Chinese. They were depicting Xinjiang as being eternally Han and Buddhist. And on the other hand, the Uyghurs were depicted as some victims of Islamic terrorism in the past, because the Chinese, like Mr. Shu, who was before, I even quarreled with him, because their main theme was that Islam doesn't belong here. These Uyghurs, they are not Muslims, but in the 10th century we had the Karahanids and some other Turkish terrorists who came from, and Arabs who came from Central Asia, who fought against these Uyghurs and forcefully made them Muslims. But our job as a communist and enlightened communists that we are, is that we will return them back to their origin, and we will remove Islam from them. And if we cannot make them communists, at least we will turn them into Buddhism or Taoism or what have you. So parallel with that, our Chinese friends, they sent us in Urumqi in a number of museums. One of them was this exhibition on major incidents of violence and terror in Xinjiang. And if you can go to the next slide, they were showing to us a number of terrorist attacks that have happened in China and Xinjiang from the Uyghurs and other minorities. If you can, the next one. Now, during the presentations that we had in Urumqi, the theme of the Chinese hosts of us was that China is facing terrorism, and people from Burton, the head of the World Uyghur Congress, to Rabia Kader and Dalai Lama, they are all equal to Islamic Party of Turkestan and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Syria. So, in few words, the narrative that we had was that this guy, the poor Dalai Lama, and Rabia Kader and Burton Issa, they have bombs and they kill people around. Next slide. Apart from demonizing the Uyghurs and their opposition and their human rights activists, as I said before, the Chinese were trying to convince the Uyghurs, but also the outside world, that Islam has no place in Xinjiang. This is in the State Museum of Urumqi, no, sorry, of Aksu, because the Chinese historians that we had to deal with, apart from lecturing to us the history of how Xinjiang has and is eternally Han-Chinese, they sent us to state museums, because state museums serve, in a way, as the temple of the secular theology of nationalism, whereby the state constructs the fake narrative that it wants the people to get in. So they send us to state museums in Urumqi, in Aksu, in Kashgar, and in those state museums, the history that the Chinese had constructed was an imperialist Han-Chinese history. I was surprised by the narrative that they had. I even debated with my Chinese friends because I told them, you claim to be Marxist-Leninists, but according to Marx, proletarians, they have no nation. And for you to be a real communist, you should have a more Marxist approach to the history. But their approach was imperialist. So for them, the historical narrative starts with different dynasties that China had. The Mings, and I don't know all the names because I'm no specialist in China. So their whole history was history of the bourgeoisie. And this history was then culminating with the Communist Party of China, which was in a way being shown as the present ruling imperial palace and power, which is inheriting the power of the previous imperial powers of China. And when it came to the religion, because this is my specialization, look what they were writing in their museums, because they were showing we were Buddhists and we had adopted Buddhism, we had Taoism, we had this and that. But when it came to Islam in the Uyghur region that they are ruling, where the religion of the majority of people is Islam, they were very straightforward on insulting the religion of the majority of their people. And they were saying, no, this is a foreign religion. Look what they say. Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Nasranism, and other religions coexist, but in the middle of the 10th century, Islam, a religious war has been launched by these Turkish kingdoms, which they forced Islam on the Uyghurs. And so they say Uyghurs believe in Islam is not the result of the voluntary conversion and transformation of the people, but the forced implementation by religious wars and the ruling class. So they treat Islam here somehow in Marxist terms, because they say it was the ruling, the bourgeoisie, who came from outside and invaded Xinjiang, this Turkish bourgeoisie or the imperialists or the feudals of Turkish feudals who imposed Islam on our Uyghurs. But when it came to Buddhism and other religions, they were saying, no, these are our religions. Even though even Buddhism and Taoism and other religions were also imposed on Xinjiang and Turkestan by the Chinese ruling monarchies and empires in the past. Next slide. The idea that Islam is not the religion of Xinjiang, but is a foreign religion, an imposed religion, is mentioned even in the white papers. I mean, I have so many white papers, but I just put it, this for example for you. But look what they say. Go back, please. They say Islam is neither an indigenous belief of the Uyghurs, nor the sole religion of the Uyghur people, and they continue, but it was imposed. Go next. So the main idea that the Chinese were trying to propagate in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs, but even to their own Han Chinese colonists, was that we have a problem in Xinjiang, and the problem is Islam. Islam came from outside, is a religion of the ruling elites who oppress the Uyghurs. Islam is producing terrorists, and the solution, what is? War on Islam. On the other hand, in the museums that our Han Chinese rulers of Xinjiang sent us, they were depicting the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and the Tatars and other Muslim groups of Xinjiang in how can I put it, in a artistic way. I mean, they were depicting you guys as being some kind of animals who live in a zoo, and the Chinese, who are culturally superior to you, they are here to civilize you, and they were showing the primitive way of your living. And in Kashgar, when they sent us, in the State Museum of Kashgar, the narrative was very brutal, very racist, but it was my mistake that I didn't take pictures there. And they were showing the Uyghurs as being uncivilized people, and showing to us that these people didn't have toilets in their homes, they were dirty. I'm sorry, they were using very brutal words, but they were saying, since when we came, we are bulldozing and destroying the old Kashgar ancient city, and we're building modern buildings. So in few words, what the Chinese authorities who were ruling Xinjiang, because we did not see Uyghurs in power there, we saw them, the highest Uyghur that we saw in power was a school teacher in Kashgar, but all the ruling elites, all the apparatchiks, and almost everybody who had power in Xinjiang, they were Han Chinese. So the idea that they were showing to us was that we, the superior Han Chinese who are coming from other parts of China, are here to bring progress, to fight terrorism and extremism, which means Islam, to civilize those barbarians, and to turn Xinjiang into a major economic power hub of China. If you can go to the next slide, please. Now, when we were in Urumqi, even though the Chinese were trying to show to us that things are nice, that they love the Uyghurs, and at the beginning I was naive and I wanted to believe that and say, okay, I mean the Chinese are investing here, they had some problem with terrorism. What I found out was that when we visited Urumqi, this is downtown, the old city, the bazaar in Urumqi, this magnificent ancient mosque was closed. And I was very shocked, and I told to the Chinese, where is the mosque here? They had turned it all into a bazaar, into a shop. Then they told me, this mosque doesn't exist anymore, but they told me across the street there is a Hui mosque. The Hui Chinese are Chinese Muslims. So I crossed the street, and that mosque was also closed. And I told them, what is going on? I mean, there are no mosques in here. Why you have closed the mosques? So I had here, we started to have the first impressions that things were very bad, because the Chinese, our visit was totally choreographed. When we were driving in the streets, the whole state police was at our service, traffic was being blocked, because we were the holy people who had come from the West or outside of China, and we were the guys that we were expected to give to the world the fake story of what is going on. If you can go to the next slide. Now, parallel with the lectures And the propaganda that the Chinese made to us, they sent us to the Xinjiang Islamic Institute. This is one institute that the Chinese government has built in order to produce the politically correct Islam. And here, next slide, we met with Sheikh Abdul Rakib bin Tumas something. I was told that he's a Hui Chinese, he's not an Uyghur. He was a very authoritarian person. And next slide, and the other one. And here we were presented with a group of Uyghur, Kazakh, Kyrgyz Muslims. They were mainly peasants whom the Communist Party had taken from villages of Xinjiang, and they were being taught in Chinese. They were taught to speak Chinese, and they were the imams that China was preparing in order to administer the mosques, but only for Friday that they were opening. Because what we found out, especially when we were in Kashgar, in the main mosque of the city, was that the mosques were not operational every day, like they should be 5 times per day, but they were operational only on Friday, Juma. And the people who were going to mosques were people 60 and above, because if you were to be younger, the Communist Party would come after you and they would arrest you and send you to concentration camp, where they will lock you for the coming 2, 3, 4 years, force you to renounce your identity, stop speaking your native language, force you to speak 24 hours per day Chinese, and chant for the Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, and reject all your culture and tradition, and moreover eat pork and be considered a criminal. So, after being lectured for about 3 days, then, next slide, then on the 4th day, we went to Aksu. Aksu, from the very name, the people who understand the language, is originally Uyghur Turkic city, but now was suffering Han Chinese colonization, like Urumqi and what have you. And after visiting the State Museum there and some other places, the Communist Party officials, they drove us like 1 hour around 100 kilometers in the middle of the desert, and they sent us to Wensu County Vocational Training Center. So these are the infamous concentration camps. Our Chinese friends called them